Welcome back to another session in our series, Cries of the Heart, based on the book Cries of the Heart by Ravi Zacharias. Bringing God Near When He Feels So Far is the subtitle to this book, and it was relevant when it was written in 1998, and of course continues to be relevant today. We have looked at the cry to know God, the cry to feel my faith, the cry for a reason in suffering, the cry of a guilty conscience, the cry for freedom in pleasure. And now we move to the cry of a lonely heart. Thomas Wolfe wrote, "The whole conviction of my life now rests upon the belief that loneliness, far from being a rare and curious phenomenon, peculiar to myself and a few other solitary people, is actually the central and inevitable feature of human existence. All this hideous doubt, despair, and dark confusion of the soul, a lonely man must know, for he is united to no image save that which he creates himself. He is bolstered by no other knowledge save that which he can gather for himself with the vision of his own eyes and brain. He is sustained and cheered and aided by no party. He is given comfort by no creed. He has no faith in him except his own, and often that faith deserts him, leaving him shaken and filled with impotence. Then it seems to him that his life has come to nothing, that he is ruined, lost, and broken, past redemption, and that morning, that bright and shining morning, with its promise of new beginnings, will never come upon the earth again as it did once." And then another super encouraging quote that Dr. Zacharias gives is by D.H. Lawrence. "We want to delude ourselves that of the problem of our emptiness, love is at the root. I want to say to you it isn't. Love is only the branches. The root goes beyond love, a naked kind of isolation, an isolated me that does not meet and mingle and never can. It is true what I say. There is a beyond in me which goes further than love, beyond the scope of stars. Just as some stars are beyond the scope of our vision, so our own search goes beyond the scope of love. At least I think that is at the root, going beyond love itself." Dr. Zacharias says, "Have these two authors touched the throbbing nerve of a reality that holds all of us in its grip? Are they telling it as it really is? Or is this just literary license in the hands of melodramatic and eccentric artists?" Well, Dr. Zacharias kind of gives us yes and no as the answer. He feels there is a truth, a reality that haunts all human beings. We might call it that empty space that needs to be filled by God Himself. Dr. Zacharias then goes into culture, and of course he's writing in 1998, and he points out that the more technology we have, the more entertainment we have, the lonelier people have gotten. And I want to share with you just some stats. Of course, with COVID, we are dealing with this in ways in which Dr. Zacharias would have never dreamt, and other writers of the end of last century. 22% of Americans say they always or often feel lonely or socially isolated. And this was before COVID. This is a year or two ago. And the percentage of this group who say it has a negative effect on certain areas of their life: mental health, more than half; physical health, more than half; personal relationships, basically half; and the ability to do their job, almost a third. And so these are real issues that people are dealing with. This was from last year in March. Nearly one-fifth of U.S. healthcare leaders plan to address social isolation in the next 12 months. Which of the following non-medical barriers to care or health will your organization take action on in the next 12 months? Social isolation is recognized as obviously the fifth one down, something that needs to be dealt with. This also is from last year, before the pandemic. Gen Z is lonely. Well, I'll tell you the loneliest group in that list. They don't even list my generation, Generation X. They put the boomers and then they skip us, and they have the millennials, which is Gen Y, and then Gen Z. So I'm assuming my generation would fall somewhere between the 50% and the 71%, probably right around 60 to 65%. Probably right on the average for the U.S. It says 61% of all U.S. adults reported feeling lonely, which is up 7% from last year. Interestingly, almost equal with men and women. A lot of times with certain mental health issues, you see a difference between men and women. Okay, so this is still before the pandemic. This is before the isolation that we've all had to deal with this past year. Now, this is from this past June, quoting stats from May. So the pandemic causes spike in anxiety and depression. Percentage of U.S. adults showing symptoms of anxiety and or depressive disorder. And obviously, in 2019, symptoms of anxiety disorder, 8.2%. Now 28.2. Symptoms of depressive disorder, 6.6. Now 24.4. Symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder, 11%, and then 33.9% now. And so definitely this cry of a lonely heart is something that is applicable for us today. Communication has increased by leaps and bounds, moving from snail mail to email to social media and all sorts of things, but people feel more isolated. Technology has gone upwards in leaps and bounds as well, with lots of ways to supposedly save time, but people are still feeling more isolated. Medicine has made things where people can live longer, but our culture seems to be devaluing human life. And then finally, human sexuality, study after study after study, and an openness that we have never seen like today. And even in 1998, Dr. Zacharias would say the same thing. But yet, people feel isolated. They don't feel bonded to other human beings, despite all these supposed advances. Is it any wonder that we sense an isolation and cynicism, a search for a beyond that seems ever more elusive? The cry of loneliness is heard from millions of hearts, and love alone is not the answer. Why then do we suffer the condition of loneliness, and what is the answer? Well, Dr. Zacharias in this chapter then turns to Scripture, the ties that bind. And he will talk about the differences between men and women in this section and how Jesus interacts with different men and women. But first of all, he tells a story. Two of the most moving stories in the New Testament will give us the clue that there is a greater pursuit in life than love. Dr. Zacharias writes, "Some time ago, my wife and I took a train journey while we were overseas, purely to be away from the intrusions of telephones and fax machines and to be alone together for a few days." The fax machines let us know that this was written in 1998. The day after we disembarked, we found ourselves at a restaurant, sharing a table with a couple who had also been on that train. I struck up a conversation with the man, as my wife did with the woman. Halfway through our conversation, I looked in the direction of my wife and noticed that she was obviously comforting this other woman, for whom tears had started to flow. I had no clue of what had transpired until we were back in our room. All through the evening, the man had talked about the law firm of which he was the senior partner. It was the largest law firm in his country and one of the most influential in the world. The entire conversation revolved around the success and busyness of his career. At the same time, his wife had told my wife that the only reason they were on this trip was to work through the grief of the death of their young son some years before. "We have never really broken free of that hurt," she wept. We have needed the time to talk about it and to face up to the tragedy. Dr. Zacharias continues, he says, 2 different points of focus were being demonstrated for 2 individuals equally wounded. One never broached the subject, but was willing to talk endlessly about his high-paced life in economic terms, while the other irrepressibly opened up to a stranger and spoke about the broken dreams of her life. The encounters of Jesus with the men and women of the Bible tell a similar tale. When he addressed Nicodemus, Jesus was talking to a man whose identity was proudly locked up in his rabbinical knowledge, yet he betrayed in ignorance of the most basic spiritual miracle, that of God's transforming power within the human heart. In the instance of the rich young ruler, Jesus was face to face with one for whom his wealth was the object of his worship. Dealing with his real needs seemed too difficult for the young ruler to concede, and he went away sorrowful, because he had wanted Jesus to endorse his primary pursuit, money. But then Jesus mentions the women. One of the stories, the woman at the well in Samaria, from John 4, and just a piece of it here for us. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." In the Gospel of John, Jesus' first confession of who he was. The story of the Samaritan woman, Dr. Zacharias writes, is often repeated because of its real-life feel. Here was one who lived a life of quiet desperation. Listening in on her conversation as she talked to Jesus about her hope for the coming of the Messiah someday, and her puzzlement over which mountain to worship in, leaves one suspecting that her real struggle in life had not yet been broached. Jesus' disarmingly gentle triumph in getting her to admit that her pathetic state of rejection was the chief of her woes is a classic illustration of how God unmasks our facades of concerns. Dr. Zacharias mentions a second story that is even more dramatic. It is one that has even inspired hymn writers over the years. The incident takes place in the home of a Pharisee named Simon. The narrative clearly would have shocked both the ones in the story and the readers who would later read the story as it built toward a proverbial climax. Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner." And Jesus answering said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." And he answered, "Say it, teacher." A certain moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon answered, "The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt." And Jesus said to him, "You have judged rightly." Jesus then proceeded to point out to Simon that even though he had come into his home as a guest, none of the courtesies offered a guest were accorded him. There had been no embrace, no water to wash his feet, no towel with which to dry them. No offer was made to bring refreshment for him after his dust-ridden journey. This woman, by contrast, dared to come in uninvited. She had given to Jesus the best of her possessions and then fallen prostrate at his feet. Both this story in Luke 7 and the story of the Samaritan woman in John 4 end on a very powerful note, conveying the divine imperative for us to follow likewise. They are similar clues. In both stories to the answer of the heart's struggle of loneliness and the longing for the beyond. But before we can reach that point, there is an existential journey we must take. Dr. Zacharias then talks about the loves we need and mentions a book by C.S. Lewis called The Four Loves. In this book, he goes through 4 Greek words that the New Testament uses to talk about love. The word for affection, the word for friendship, you would be familiar with that one because of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. It's phileo. Eros, which is erotic love, the love between a husband and a wife. And then charity or agape love, true love, that God has for us and Christians should have for one another. C.S. Lewis points out right at the beginning of the book, however fulfilling that love may be, Lewis had ingenuously mirrored the soul of humanity in its hunger for something greater. C.S. Lewis talks about 2 loves, need love, and next week we'll get to gift love as we pull all this together, this cry of a lonely heart. Someone who noted these needs that human beings have was Abraham Maslow, who is best known for his ideas on individual self-actualization, which you see there at the top of the chart. That is how each one of us reaches his or her full potential. On a more popular level, Maslow is known for his hierarchy of needs, which he offered as a scale on which we ascend to fulfilling that potential. The hierarchy he lays out, from birth to maturity, are our physiological needs, safety needs, love needs, esteem needs, and finally the need for self-actualization. Dr. Zacharias points out that he would not be coming at this from a Christian perspective, and C.S. Lewis and Dr. Zacharias and others would feel that there are things missing in this from a Christian worldview. But those differences, Dr. Zacharias writes, are not the reason for referencing his psychological theory. Rather, it is to point out a fundamental agreement between those of his school who wrestle with motivational theories and those who, like C.S. Lewis, use an existential apologetic. They start from the common ground of need that we human beings share with one another. But there's also another one that needs to be noted, another difference. Behaviorists have their reasons for this, but the difference is there. They observe certain patterns of behavior from which they move backward to define what our essence must be, rather than starting with our essence and moving forward to explain our behavior. For us, we know that we are made in the image of God, and so we move from that. Behaviorists and Maslow and others like him move from what they observe in us and try to move back to what we really are. But of course that doesn't work. And those like Wolfe and Lawrence will never find an answer to the beyond outside of a Christian response. It always comes back to Christ. It always comes back to God. It always comes back to the Word. This is where we find our truth in any of these cries. The cry to know God, the cry to feel our faith, the cry for a reason in suffering, the cry of a guilty conscience, the cry for freedom and pleasure. All of these, if we try to answer them, if we try to deal with them by putting God off to the side, there are no conclusions. There are no end results. But when God is at the center of all these cries, including the cry of a lonely heart, that's when we can make progress. In the next section, Dr. Zacharias talks about a mystery by design, is how he titles this. And he pictures life this way, that life in and of itself is a mystery and thrilling and full of intrigue. Even birth. I don't know if this is true, but Dr. Zacharias talks about his feeling that God doesn't allow us to remember our births because it's too amazing and too fantastic for us to remember that. It would just be almost something that would blow our minds. He quotes a man named Lewis Thomas, who wrote in his in Medusa and the Snail, he writes, "The mere existence of that cell should be one of the greatest astonishments of the earth. People ought to be walking around all day, all through their waking hours, calling to each other in endless wonderment, talking of nothing except that cell. If anyone does succeed in explaining it within my lifetime, I will charter a skywriting airplane, maybe a fleet of them, and send them aloft to write one great exclamation point after another around the whole sky until all my money runs out." He's talking about a cell. And it's true. Cells are unbelievable and they're amazing. And that's life in a nutshell. Life is amazing. We have uniqueness. Each one of us is a unique human being. And we've briefly touched on the idea of essence, but that's not all we need to consider. Not only do we each have essence, being made in the image of God, but there is a coalescence in how we interact with each other. There is a unique wholeness, Dr. Zacharias writes, that is indivisible. We have essence and we work as a whole. He mentions that in the case of Solomon and the two women who were fighting over the baby, half a baby plus half a baby does not equal a baby. Half a baby plus half a baby is no baby at all. And so the normal math, so to speak, doesn't work when we're talking about human beings. And he talks about a man and a woman who come together in marriage. And how, yeah, you might, on a survey, you'd count on 1 + 1 as 2, but people in love realize that 1 + 1 is way more than 2, way more profound. And when a couple has a baby, same thing. It's not something you just count. It's something beyond and something amazing. This need love is very poignantly illustrated in a story from a young lady, or about a young lady named Kathy. I remember receiving these books back when I was at Fishing Green Kenny the first time, back in the 90s, and then also at the Hendersonville Church of Christ. These books came from a place called Covenant House in New York City, and this house would help runaway children, either runaways or ones who had been kidnapped and then escaped from their kidnappers. Dr. Zacharias obviously must have been on the same mailing list that I was. And so this is what he writes in this part of the chapter. He says, "Some months ago, I received a copy of a mailing from a ministry in New York City that works with young people who are trapped in the drug scene and often caught in the hellish web of prostitution. I cannot recall when a few words from a stranger left such heaviness within my heart. Prior to the salutation, the writer warned the reader that it would be difficult to believe the contents, but vowed that every word of it was true. Here's the text of that letter." And these little books that would come out would tell stories. Of course, they were trying to get funding for Covenant House. They're trying to get help and to help the kids. But they felt the best way to do that was to tell the stories. And they were always just heart-wrenching, always just terrible. And here's one of these letters that I'll share with you now. This is the one in the chapter. "Dear friend, She came to our front door Tuesday morning dressed in dirty rags, holding a little aluminum paint can in her arms. From the second she stepped inside our shelter, she mystified us. Whatever she did, wherever she went, the paint can never left her hands. When Kathy sat in the crisis shelter, the can sat in her arms. She took the can with her to the cafeteria that first morning she ate, and to bed with her the first night she slept. When she stepped into the shower, the can was only a few feet away. When the tiny homeless girl dressed, the can rested alongside her feet. "I'm sorry, this is mine," she told our counselors whenever we asked her about it. "This can belongs to me." "Do you want to tell me what's in it, Kathy?" I'd ask her. Not today," she said, "not today." When Kathy was sad or angry or hurt, which happened a lot, she took her paint can to a quiet dorm room on the third floor. Many times on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, I'd pass her room and watch her rock gently back and forth, the can in her arms. Sometimes she'd talk to the paint can in low whispers. I've been around a lot of troubled kids in my life. I'm used to seeing them carry stuffed animals. Some of the roughest, toughest kids at Covenant House have a stuffed animal. Every kid has something, needs something to hold. But a paint can? I could feel alarm bells ringing in my head. Early this morning, I decided to accidentally run into her again. "Would you like to join me for breakfast?" I said. "That would be great," she said. For a few minutes, we sat in a corner of our cafeteria, talking quietly over the din of 150 ravenous homeless kids. Then I took a deep breath and plunged into it. "Kathy, that's a really nice can. What's in it?" For a long time, Kathy didn't answer. She rocked back and forth, her hair swaying across her shoulders. Then she looked over at me, tears in her eyes. "It's my mother," she said. "Oh," I said. "What do you mean it's your mother?" "It's my mother's ashes," she said. "I went and got them from the funeral home. See, I even asked them to put a label right here on the side. It has her name on it." Kathy held up the can before my eyes. A little label on the side chronicled all that remained of her mother. Date of birth, date of death, name. That was it. Then Kathy pulled the can close and hugged it. "I never really knew my mother," Kathy told me. "I mean, she threw me in the garbage 2 days after I was born." We checked Kathy's story. Sure enough, the year Kathy was born, the New York newspapers ran a story saying that police had found a little infant girl in a dumpster, and yes, it was 2 days after Kathy was born. Kathy continued, "I ended up living in a lot of foster homes, mad at my mother. But then I decided I was going to find her. I got lucky. Someone knew where she was living. I went to her house. She wasn't there. My mother was in the hospital. She had AIDS. She was dying. So I went to the hospital and I got to meet her the day before she died. My mother told me that she loved me." Kathy said, crying. "She told me that she loved me." We double-checked Kathy's story. Every word of it was true. I reached out and hugged Kathy, and she cried in my arms for a long time. It was tough getting my arms around her because she just wouldn't put the paint can down. But she didn't seem to mind. I know I didn't. I saw Kathy again a couple hours ago, eating dinner in our cafeteria. She made a point to come up and say hi, and I made a point to give her an extra hug. I felt like crying tonight. I can't seem to stop feeling this way. I guess this story, the whole horrible, sad, unreal mess, has gotten to me tonight. I guess that's why I just had to write you this letter." Then Dr. Zacharias adds, "Could there be another heart-wrenching story that expressed need love in more poignant terms? Kathy's cry from the garbage dump of rejection signaled both the agony and the glory of human existence. Was Kathy looking for love, or was there something more? Dr. Zacharias writes, "I believe it was something more." Let us leave this all-important first step for now and return to it when we are ready to pull all of the forms of love together. I'm going to give you a little preview of next week. We're going to move from need love to gift love and talk about the loves, and then move to the end. And I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of the end. Dr. Zacharias, near the end of the chapter, quotes "O Little Town of Bethlehem," and here's the line he quotes: "The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." once again, it's going to come back full circle to Christ. Come back to God Almighty. Come back to God's revelation and His Word and how it can enrich our lives. I didn't want to end necessarily on that note, so I've put in a great message of love here from Ruth, just these few verses, 15 to 22. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Of course, what Naomi didn't know is that Ruth would be one of the ancestors of our Lord, Jesus Christ. She would end up with Boaz, and the rest is history, so to speak. This cry of loneliness, the cry of a lonely heart, is very, very serious. A lot of people feel very lonely. A lot of people feel extra lonely this year in 2020 due to the pandemic. Let's be praying for people who are lonely. Let's be seeking them out. Let's make phone calls, write notes, do the things that we can do to help. All of us, as Dr. Zacharias pointed out, have a lonely heart, and we need it to be fulfilled. And there's something just a tad greater than love that will provide that, and we'll answer those questions next week. May the Lord bless you and keep you.